first time here, my name's Nate. I want to welcome you. If you didn't already fill out a Connect card, we want to invite you to do that with as much information as you feel comfortable and put that in the offering bucket later in the service. This is a great way for us to connect with you and to connect you with everything going on here at Velocity. Now, who's excited for the big game later? Are we excited? All 7 of you and me. Yes. My favorite Super Bowl fun fact is the Browns have never lost a Super Bowl. You can fact check me on that. That's true. You can fact check me on that. Good morning. I want to kick off this morning by asking you a question. Have you ever dreamed of winning the lottery? We've all fantasized about this from time to time, right? Like my dream, I sort of imagine I'm at the gas station, I'm buying my freezy, of course, and I reach in my pocket and I find a surprise $5 bill and I go, do you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to buy a Powerball ticket. I buy a Powerball ticket and in this dream, I go home, I'm drinking my freezy, I turn on the TV, and as they're reading the numbers one after another, it's matching my card and I have instantly become a millionaire. Right? We think about these moments so often that they've become icebreaker questions that we ask each other when we're getting to know one another, or questions that we ask each other when we're on long car rides, like, hey, what would you do if you won the lottery? Right? I would bet that every single person in this room has been asked that question. And while all of our answers are a little bit different, like for me, I usually say, man, if I won millions and millions of dollars, I'd probably put it all towards my school debt, and then my bill would probably be cut in half, right? You're laughing. I wish I was kidding. But while all of our answers are a little bit different, there seems to be a lot of similarities between our answers. Like the first thing people usually do is complain about the taxes they would have to pay, right? Because even in our imagination, we're upset about taxes. And then people usually talk about paying off debts, paying off mortgages, buying newer and more reliable cars. We talk about how we would help friends and family, but not too much, right? We don't want to be taken advantage of. We talk about the organizations we would donate to, the foundations we would start. We talk about how we would get really good at saving money. But the thing that I find interesting is that the things people think they would do if ever they were to hit the jackpot are completely different from the reality of what actually happens. In fact, I read an article this week by Business Insider entitled 20 Lottery Winners Who Lost Every Penny. And in this article, Matt Abaday explains the secret truth behind what winning the lottery is really like. Abaday writes, while hitting the jackpot is a long shot, holding on to the money is the real challenge. In fact, he reported that one study showed 70% of people lost all of their winnings within 5 years. But he also wrote about people like Bud Post, whose experience hitting the jackpot was less like a dream and more like a nightmare. See, Bud Post won $16.2 million in the Pennsylvania lottery, but found himself $1 million in debt within a year. And his story was totally insane. I mean, you would have expected everything to get better once he won big, but the exact opposite was true. Because right after winning, his ex-girlfriend sued him for a third of all that he earned. And not just that, soon after, his brother was arrested for hiring a hitman to kill him so that he could win a share of the money. But Bud wasn't innocent in all of this either. Besides making some really bad investments that sunk him into fast debt, Bud was also arrested for firing a gun over the head of a bill collector. This did not go how anyone would have expected. And Bud was quoted saying, "I was much happier when I was broke." Which should lead us to ask a very interesting question. If so many people dream about winning tons and tons of cash, why are the people who do so statistically bad at managing what they earn? And the funny thing is, the Bible has so much to say about this topic. Because today we're going to read a story about a man that was exceedingly wealthy. I mean, this man had more money than you could possibly imagine. He literally, the Bible tells us, had bags and bags of gold. In fact, we're going to see that this guy was so wealthy that before going on vacation, he gave away bags of gold to multiple people in order for them to invest. But before we read this passage today, I need to explain something in order for this whole thing to make sense. When Jesus taught, he often used a style of storytelling called teaching in parables. Now, a parable is a story that teaches a moral or spiritual lesson. And Jesus used this type of storytelling all the time. In fact, in the book of Luke alone, Jesus told 24 parables. And the reason that Jesus taught this way is because he wanted to teach us something about God in a way that we could really understand. And now that we get that, I want us to hear the parable that Jesus taught in Matthew 25. Jesus said, "Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey." Okay, so right away in this story, we are introduced to a man who has so much money. He has extreme wealth. So much so that the Bible tells us that before going to travel, he entrusted shares of his fortune to servants in various bags of gold. Now, this doesn't mean that he was simply asking them to watch over his money, right? He wasn't asking them to babysit his money because one day he was going to come back into town and say, "Hey, I need you to give me back exactly what I gave you." No. Instead, by giving them this money, he was actually putting them to work. We know this because in this time period, it wasn't uncommon for a wealthy person to give money to servants or employees in order for them to invest and turn a profit. And we still do this today, right? We hire companies to invest our money so that one day we can get a profit on our investment. That's why some of us invest in the stock market and others of us invest in 401k. But since none of these things existed in biblical times, people had to share their money with servants in order for them to win a profit. But I want you to see what happens next in verse 16. It says, "The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money." Now there's something in this story that I don't want you to miss. The man who went on this journey trusted his money to these servants. Not that they would watch over it, not that they would babysit it, but he trusted that with their time and their labor, they would be able to produce a profit. And that's what the first guy did, right? He took all he earned and he doubled his investment. The second guy took all that he earned and he doubled his investment. But the Bible tells us that the last man did something different. He did nothing. And we know that this was wrong because the servants would have known what the master expected. It wasn't confusing to them. They weren't wondering what he wanted them to do. They knew what was culturally right. And that's why the first 2 men knew exactly what to do. He didn't tell them how much he expected. They just simply knew the expectation was to get to work and to earn a profit. So they got to work with their gold and they earned a profit. The other man didn't do that. He simply protected what he was given by digging a hole and burying it in the dirt. In other words, he did nothing with what he was given. And the problem is, when someone loans you money, there's going to come a day when they come back into town and say, "Hey, what did you do with what I gave you?" And if I'm the first 2 people in this story, man, I'm excited for that day, right? I'm looking forward to this day because I got the money, I got to work, I used my time, my labor, I put my blood, sweat, and tears into this thing, and man, I doubled the investment. I can't wait to say, "Master, look at what I did." But the third man, he must have dreaded this day. Because that master's going to come back into town. He's going to say, "Hey, what did you do with what I gave you?" And this man is going to have to look at him and say the only honest answer you can say, which is, "I did nothing." And sure enough, Jesus tells us that the master did come back into town. I want you to see what Jesus says in verse 19. It says, "After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more.' And his master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness.' In the same way, the man with 2 bags of gold came also. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more.' And his master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness.'" So the first 2 guys do exactly what you would hope, right? They say, "Look, I doubled the investment." And then the man replies exactly as you would expect. He's ecstatic. But not only that, he's so pleased with how they did that he says, "Now I'm going to trust you with even more and more money." But then the scene switches. The scene switches to the third man, the man who buried his gold in the dirt and did nothing with what he was given. And I want you to see what it says in verse 24. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid. And I went out and I hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. Now, I really want us to pay close attention to the words that he used. He starts out by saying, Master, I knew that you were a hard man, which is another way of saying, hey, I knew that you were a difficult person. So before showing him, look, I didn't do anything with what you gave me, before kind of being honest about that, he's starting to build this argument, which is really, this is kind of your fault. And then he goes on to say something kind of interesting. He says, I know that you're the kind of guy that harvests where you have not planted, and you reap where you have not scattered seed, which is a really crafty, Bible-y way of saying, you're a thief. I know that you kind of leave town and you come back and you take what's yours and more. So you're a hard man, you're a difficult man. I don't like you, I don't trust you, you're a thief. And by the way, I didn't do anything. And I want you to see how the master responds in verse 26. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. It's kind of the opposite of good, faithful. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers. So at least then when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So this master is furious, right? And rightfully so. And he doesn't agree with the man's methods. He says, okay, so you don't trust me. You think I'm a thief. Well, at least then you could have taken my money and given it to the bank if you really think the bank is more trustworthy than me, right? That was funny even back then. If you really think the bank is more trustworthy than me, you could have at least done that. Then when I would go to the bank and take back my loan, I would have received it with interest. But I'm not just mad, the master's saying, that you didn't trust me. I'm not just mad that you're now accusing me because of your laziness. I'm upset because I trusted you with something. Right? Like, this is personal. I gave you something. And there was an expectation. And you took what I gave you and you did nothing. And there's countless lessons that can be learned from this section of Scripture. I mean, from this section of Scripture alone, we can learn so much about finances, about saving, about investing, about being an employee, about being a manager. But I think if we look really closely at the text, there's a lesson even greater than these. Because if you remember what we learned that parables are stories that Jesus would tell in order that we would understand something more about God in a way that we could really understand. And if we look at this story, we can see that Jesus is using this parable to teach us something about God. Because in this parable, God is being compared to the rich master, and Jesus is comparing us to the servants. Because just like the master in this story, God has given something to each and every one of us. God blesses us with jobs and with kids and with spouses and with opportunities and connections. And just as the rich man gave 5 bags to one and 2 to another and 1 to the last, God gives us different things too, doesn't he? I mean, that's why some of us play instruments and others of us play sports. That's why some of us are awesome teachers or great with tools and others of us understand numbers. Because God blesses each of us differently with different gifts and talents and passions and abilities. But in this story, we don't only see that God gives different things to each of us, we also see that when God blesses us, we have a choice. We have a choice to either do something with what God has given us or to take all of our God-given resources, talents, abilities, and passions and bury them in the dirt. We have a decision to do something or to do nothing at all. And I want to give you a real-life example this morning of a guy who could have buried his talent in the dirt, but he didn't. I had a professor in college named Dan Dyke. Now, Dan was a different kind of teacher. Dan was one of those professors that made everyone his student. I mean, he always ate in the dining hall and sat with students. He would frequent the coffee shop on campus and buy students coffee and just hang out. He was one of those guys that would teach and everyone was just so drawn in. He was just a different kind of teacher. But Dan wasn't always a college professor in Cincinnati. Before that, he was teaching at a very small school in Maryland, where he was teaching a few less classes and making a lot less money. And while he was at that school, Dan went above and beyond in almost every area imaginable. I mean, he was a great speaker, a great teacher. He was super relational. He was an incredible mentor, a phenomenal advisor. But there was another talent that Dan had that he felt that he could use, but wasn't. See, Dan noticed that the school had a need. Someone needed to landscape their property because they had a very large campus, even though it was a small school. But the school wasn't able to afford someone to landscape on a regular basis. And it just so happened that Dan owned a riding lawnmower and was a phenomenal landscaper. So what Dan would do is every week he would drive his lawnmower across the street from the campus, because that's where he lived, just right across the street. He would ride over with his son in his lap, and each and every week he would mow their lawn. He never asked for an extra dollar. This was just his way of helping out and allowing the college to save money. He didn't have to do this. It wasn't in his job description. It wasn't something the school expected from him. But it was the one thing he was able to do. And instead of burying it in the dirt, instead of saying, look, I'm doing so many other things well, I don't really need to do this. He said, no, I see this need. I feel like God is maybe asking me to do this. So he stepped up. And well, little did he know, one day while he was out mowing, a president from another university was in town named Ron Gary. Ron Gary was the president of a university in Cincinnati. And he was in Maryland fundraising at different colleges and churches. And Ron didn't have to be on campus long before he heard the name Dan Dyke and heard the reputation of the ways that he went above and beyond for the school and its students. And when he heard all these things, he had to meet him. He sent a student, he said, hey, go get Professor Dan and bring him to me. I have to meet this guy. And Dan showed up, grass stains all over him. He was dirty. He was holding his son, and he shakes his hand, and the two guys, they just talk for a while. And Dan thought nothing of it. He's like, man, this is just a really cool conversation. This is a good guy. But little did he know, Ron was interviewing him for a job. You see, Ron was looking for people like Dan to work at his college because he admired his work ethic. And later that week, Ron called Dan and asked him to teach full-time in Cincinnati, where he would be teaching more classes and be making more money and be able to provide a better life for his wife and his kids. And Dan was shocked. I mean, he didn't know he was interviewing for a job. He just thought he was having a conversation, but when he found this out, he graciously accepted. And I love this story because Dan had no idea that going above and beyond would one day afford him this amazing opportunity. And the best part to me is, it's not why he did it. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And it would have been so easy for Dan to say, look, I'm teaching, I'm a mentor, I'm advising for classes, I'm doing all of these things so well. I know that the school has this need, I know that I have this talent, but I can justify not stepping up this way. I can bury this thing in the dirt and ignore it. But he didn't do that. He said, I'm going to do something with what God has given me. And because he was willing to do that, God was able to bless him in the most incredible way. So let me ask you a question. What are the areas in our life that we're burying in the dirt? I know I have some, right? Like I find myself so often like, man, I'm doing so many things. People ask me, Nate, what are you up to? I'm like, I don't know, I'm busy, right? I'm keeping busy. But if I'm being honest, like I'm kind of willing to serve in this way or that way, but there's areas in my life where I've just not been willing to invest. Right? Like what are those areas in our life where we've been burying in the dirt? What are those areas that we can unbury and begin utilizing to serve people in incredible ways? Is it our money? Like if we've been willing to kind of step up with our time and our talent, but with our treasure we've sort of held on really tightly. Is God saying, hey, trust me in this? Unbury that. Maybe for you it's your kindness. I know that sounds super silly, like what is he saying? We bury kindness in the ground, what does that mean? But for some of us, I know that we serve in so many amazing ways, but I find myself sometimes doing so much that I forget to just see the people around me. Maybe God is saying, as you're serving, as you're doing, notice people. Smile goes a long way, a conversation goes a long way. Build connections with people along the way and be vulnerable. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's your patience. Maybe it's your willingness to learn. Maybe it's that thing that God has been telling you to do for months and months or years and years, and you've just sort of put it on the back burner. You've sort of buried it in the dirt. You said, look, I know that I sort of have that. I'm going to protect that for another day. God's saying, no, it's time to unbury those things. And I don't know what those things are for you, but I know this. I know that when we don't hide anything in the dirt, when we're all in, God has a way of blessing the things that we invest in. Let me pray for us. Dear God, thank you so much for who you are and just the opportunity to meet here today. God, I just pray that you would allow us to, in this moment, think of those things that we might be burying in the dirt. You are such a faithful God. To me, that just means all the promises you've ever made, all the amazing things you could ever do, you have done and you have kept. You've been faithful to us. God, this week, would you allow us to see those areas of our life where we can be more faithful to you? Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.